you please introduce yourself and your field of study?
Sure, I'm Dr. Bill Watson, and I'm a professor in learning design and technology that's in education. And I'm also the director of the Purdue University Center for Serious Games and Learning in Virtual Environments.
Great, thank you. Good. Could you maybe tell me more about what you've been researching recently, or what kind of brought you to this field of research of serious games?
Sure. So I started in university by focusing on English literature and creative writing, and then eventually found myself and found my way into computer technology. And so I was a lecturer of computer technology, and I had two very distinct groups of students at this campus, which is a commuter campus. People drive in, they drive out. It's not kind of your traditional campus. And I had students fresh out of high school, so your kind of traditional 19, 20-year-olds. And then I had about half the students were people who had been in industry working for, at least a decade, often even more, and were now coming back for their degrees. And so the difference between these two groups of students was so profound, in that those fresh out of high school were really unable to manage their own learning. They're extremely passive. You had to really drag them to anything. You had to almost force them to learn, whereas those who had been out of the school environment for a while were very curious. They really wanted to wring all the learning they could out of. They would push back and ask questions, had a lot of critical thinking. And so that really got me thinking, what is kind of going on here, and how can I engage these students who are so passive in their learning, and who have been trained to be passive in their learning. So I decided to go back and get my PhD around educational technology. At that time it was called, with a focus on video games, because I grew up a gamer. And to me, here in the US, still I would say almost 90% of students have in some way encountered this educational video game called the Oregon Trail. So when I was a kid, this was on the old Apple IIc, very basic graphics, but they've updated over the years. My experience with that was that, play this video game and you'll learn. And so I played it as a gamer, which meant I spent my entire time hunting, shooting animals, because you shoot things in video games, and really didn't learn much of what I could have potentially learned from that. So that was really kind of what swung me to, how can we have instruction that's more engaging? But then I really broadened my view after that to look at, what is it about the educational system that's producing such passive students, where they come in excited to learn, and then they leave the system almost unable to learn, unable to drive themselves to learn. And my original focus was video games as an answer to that, and I still think it's a piece of that. But I've really been brought into, how can we change the system so it's more focused on promoting lifelong learning rather than killing lifelong learning.
Okay, great. That's interesting. I mean, I have questions on that myself, but I guess maybe just so we have that kind of definition in, or what do you understand under? I mean, yeah, the term serious games is used a lot in the literature, and I guess, I don't know, what do you kind of define under that that title, that phrase?
So I guess I would call a serious game anything that is trying to do something beyond just entertain and be a play state, because games are very good at engaging. They're very good at getting us in that play state. But if we're looking for something on the other side of things, in my case, it tends to be the educational game that we're trying to get at. But serious games can also be for advertising purposes or other things like that. So it's kind of that broad term of where we're looking beyond just the play state as a goal for the game.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So I guess this is a pointed question in the form of our research, but what role can the medium of video games play in increasing students' awareness, empathy, or understanding of sociopolitical issues? I've seen you've done research on, the case study was in a historical context. There's also a paper you co-wrote about environmental values. So how do you see that video game as like a medium? What qualities does it have to really engage students in the classroom, I guess?
Well, I really think that's the strength of video games, is that they do engage. I mean, really, that's what they're really powerful at, more than really any other medium that we deal with. So, I grew up a creative writer, I grew up a reader, and I grew up a gamer. So, I like traditional literature. I engage with traditional literature. But video games really can hook us in better than almost anything else. They can grab us, and they can bring us to an experience, and they can also put us in an environment that we otherwise wouldn't see. So You read a book and you put yourself in that environment. Even though you're looking at words on a page, you can envision it and you can see it. Video games can immerse us in an environment and give us more detail and make it more accessible. You can take 10 pages describing an environment, or you can hop in Assassin's Creed and you can see the architecture that was there and really experience it and go and look at what you want to do. So that engagement element is really powerful, and really what it is games give us the ability to make the decision, to make the choice, to interact with things rather than a more passive absorbing of what has been put there. So I really think they're very well suited, particularly in my point of view, around this sort of emotional engagement aspect where we can immerse people in a context where they otherwise have not experienced that. And they can experience what it's like in terms of what language is used around it, what point of view people look at things from, what sort of problems you encounter, what sort of solutions can you raise for those problems. And all as a form of narrative as well. So back when I kind of first got started as a grad student, there was a bit of a debate about are games really a form of narrative? And I think that's been put to bed to a degree as the genre has grown and we've seen more and more games. There are extremely powerful games out there, and we're seeing, the game series I'm obsessed with is The Last of Us, which is really an enormously powerful narrative, and that's why we're seeing it being turned into, a TV series, because they're recognizing at the core the narrative that's built around this, but it's a different experience where you're just passively watching that narrative take place, as opposed to you feel like you are the character and you are making those decisions and you're an active agent in what happens. It's a different experience. I think they're very well suited to this sort of experience, particularly around emotional aspects. My current research has broadened to look at, I don't just do games research, but part of what I've taken a look at is designing instruction around attitudinal learning. So how can we actually shift attitudes around particular topics? And one big piece of that is an affective and emotional component to it. Can you shift someone's emotions to recognize that their behavior is out of line with the cognitive elements, what they know and what they feel about those situations? And in creating this disruption between those different components of attitude, it drives them to say, I have to change something, okay? I have to learn more cognitively, or I have to change my behavior and stop contributing to this problem that I recognize I'm contributing to. So I think video games are a very good fit around not just affective components, but really putting us in this environment and giving us agency to interact with a narrative that's going to help, potentially shift attitudes and is part of that knowledge as well.
Thank you. That was very cohesive answer. The construction has been really jarring to be on TV job because of that. So yeah, that's interesting. So how should teachers approach, because your studies are mainly educational games and how games can be used in the classroom. So what role does a teacher play in kind of framing these games and aiding in this learning process?
Sure. So I think it's something that I really highlight. I really think it's important that teachers play a very central role in the use of games. So I talk about serious games. In my field, we talk about game-based learning. So the learning is based around the game. I think that's a key differentiation there, that we're not relying on the game for all of the learning. It's enormously difficult to design an effectively engaging video game. We tend to think that games are great, everyone loves games, but the vast majority of them are failures in that. They don't really necessarily do that well. So to design a really good game is really hard, and then to design really effective instruction is also difficult. So putting them together is really an enormous challenge. And to do that and say that you're going to completely rely on the game to do all elements of that, that's a challenge. So I think what we need to consider is how can we leverage teachers to increase the efficacy and the effectiveness of the games and the learning outcomes that are going to come from that. And I really think that's enormously important. So games can be excellent at hooking us and introducing us to a context, but the learning doesn't need to end there. The learning can happen beyond game playing and around the game playing. We use the game to get them interested, but that's not where the learning stops. We can have a lot of projects that go on around the game and the experience with the game. So I think if you consider the teacher and the structure they put around the game, they can play an enormous role. I published an article about how we can use problem-based learning facilitation guidelines as a component for to guide teachers on how they can work with the games and maximize the learning that's going to take place from them. And I think that's a matter of when we play video games as players, we think of them as we think of the game and we're as play. So we go through them very quickly. We're doing a lot of interaction and that sort of thing. We don't take the time to think, right? We don't take the time to reflect on what's happened. So I think with teachers, it's the opportunity to slow things down, to make sure that reflection takes place, and we can try to build that into the games. But teachers are kind of natural component in there for that to happen. So I really think teachers play a central role in, one, figuring out how games are going to be used, what they're being used for, structuring an environment around the games, including additional instruction, including additional instructional projects, and making sure that reflection piece happens so that the learning outcomes that are potentially there are taken by the students. You know, as I mentioned it before, my first encounter with the educational game was Oregon Trail, and with that, I essentially didn't get the learning opportunities that were there because I was treating it strictly as play. It's very, very easy for that to happen if a teacher's not involved. We take the play component of the game, we don't take the learning component of the game. So I think teachers are central to that happening.
I think it's interesting to think about what the learning component, because I think when you're talking maybe in a historical game, I'm assuming the Oregon Trail is about the Oregon Trail, so you're learning about the history behind that. That is how you define the learning, because I think what we've been looking at more broadly in this project is kind of this more also like as you said in your research about like changing attitudes and gaining this kind of empathy. So I was wondering, because there's many, you know, commercial games and these kind of socially aware games that aren't being used in a classroom setting, and they're still teaching kids or people something. So yeah, I think that's why I was wondering the question of like how essential do you think teachers are to guiding this? Because how successful can these social games be with just being in a play context? Yeah, that was more a comment than a question.
Sure.
But then, yeah, I think this kind of leads into how do you measure a successful application of a video game in the classroom? So yeah, are you measuring it in your research in terms of reaching these kind of learning goals in the classroom, or are there some other measures that you use in your research?
Yeah, I think with measuring them again, and how I ask teachers to treat the games is to treat them as a tool. They are not, the teacher is the one that's driving everything in terms of determining why they want to use the game and what they're using the game for. So I think determining their effectiveness is, first of all, determining what your goals are for using the game. You know, I also have teachers and encourage teachers to use commercial video games. So those are completely not designed for learning purposes. That's not what they're there for. So what are you using it for? How are you using it? What components of it are you using it for? You don't have to use the whole game. So I really think, one, it's determining what you're using it for and what context you're using it in. But typically for me, again, I'm looking at the game-based learning, not just the game. So what learning outcomes are we targeting? And are we reaching those learning goals? How are we assessing that? Now, a lot of that's determined by the environment we're in. If it's a classroom, oftentimes they have kind of certain traditional assessments that they're looking at and that sort of thing. But, you know, you had mentioned a case study I did of a history class. For us, what was so clear there was the level of engagement was so vastly different when the game was used as opposed to when it wasn't. And that students were doing additional work above and beyond what was assigned in the class. They were talking about the game over lunchtime. They were reading additional textbooks and checking out books from the library to try to win the game. But what that was doing was pushing their engagement, and in pushing their engagement, pushing their learning. You know, one thing we can very consistently see with games is that the time on task spent with a learning game will be higher than almost anything else. Students are willing to spend more time doing that and playing that. And then traditionally in education, the more time you spend trying to learn something, the more time or the better your learning will be, the more learning outcomes you will have. So that's the connection, and that's why games are so exciting, is that we can see more than anything else, students are willing to play them. And then typically the more time you spend playing something, the more learning you're going to have. So the way that we're assessing that is assessing the engagement. Obviously, if we're not seeing, if the game is so disengaging that they're not spending time with it, that they're not playing with it, that's problematic. So if engagement's a goal, that's something that we can be looking at. Engagement outside the classroom, like we saw when they didn't need to be working on class stuff, but they still were because of the video game and their excitement for it. Their time on task of learning even outside the game by reading books, those were all successes there. And then just how are you measuring the learning and how are you evaluating the learning? There's all sorts of different ways that we can do that. But again, I also see it as games as the entry point. So if we take the game-based learning as a whole, as opposed to just the game components, we can see how it can hook them into and gain interest around a topic and push that exploration further through the teacher and through additional projects.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So I when I was discussing serious games with the lead designer of Path Out, and we were discussing that there was maybe a lack of these kind of like socially aware or kind of more the video games tackling difficult topics, and how he said, well, it's a commercial market. You need to appeal to different video game producers, and so I suggested, like, why would you see like education and putting this into kind of a more educational context as a way forward to get more funding for these types of games. And this is when he mentioned that he felt that there was a big divide between the commercial games community and the serious games creators. He says that serious games are often, because they are focused and they are focused on meeting these kind of criteria to really teach, that they also do lag behind in the technology a lot of the time that maybe current games use. And so that this kind of also creates a difficulty to engage students because it is a bit behind. And then he says that even these kind of socially aware games, this is the term we were calling them, that even when they wanted to enter the classroom and kind of get into these educational spheres, that it was very difficult to get their foot in the door because there were so many barriers, there were so many requirements, there were so many so many things to meet, or also there needs to be so much funding to reach all these different formatting issues for in the classroom. So yeah, I was wondering if you've I know this is maybe a bit further from your research area, but yeah, I was wondering if you had noticed kind of this divide, or how you consider we could bridge this gap.
Sure. So a couple of things there. I do think there's a bit of a divide, but in a sense, I think the difficulty for getting games in the classroom, whether it's an educational game or whether it's a commercial game, it exists for both. And really it's that really drove me to broaden my research as a grad student from game-based learning as the sole focus to what we call systemic change of education, that we're designing new educational systems. And that's because the system of education, at least here in the US, and I would imagine it's quite the same worldwide, is a system that is teacher-centric. So it's teacher-directed. The teacher is the one putting forth all the energy, directing everything. The students are expected to be passive and quiet and receive what is given to them rather than being active. And it's also very much a time-driven system. So we are on a calendar. We are covering this content in this amount of time. We have this amount of time to learn it. If you don't learn it, it's too bad, right? You get a learning deficiency, or you eventually fail as we go forward and carry those forward with us. So that sort of inflexible, systematized approach where the calendar is driving things and seat time is driving things rather than actually learning driving things is not conducive for any sort of learning that is perhaps focused on. That sort of system is designed for efficiency. We're going to educate the most people in the least amount of time we can and get them through, and some will learn and some won't. If we're focusing on learning and everyone's going to get the learning, we're going to make sure they have the mastery and that they're mastering what they're supposed to get. That is focused more on effectiveness rather than efficiency, right? It's to get that effectiveness, to get critical thinking, to get motivation and engagement and self-directed learning and understanding metacognition, understanding how you learn best. All those sorts of outcomes that's a different system that's going to be focusing on that, because we're not going from here to there as fast as we can. We're making sure we're hitting everything that we need to. So the current system is really not designed well for taking the time to put in game-based learning, which already, anytime you're integrating technology, it's going to take a bit more time. You can run into bumps along the way. But even beyond that, the idea that we're taking class time, which traditionally has been, I, as the teacher, am going to be dumping knowledge into you, and you're going to be sitting there and hopefully receiving it. We're taking that class time where that instruction is normally coming, and we're having students play game. And that doesn't mean we don't get the knowledge there, but it's not the most effective way to do it. So whether we're talking commercial or educational games, it's difficult to get them in the current system. It's a challenge, and I've seen that again and again. I've done early on in my career here at Purdue, I did a training workshop where we trained social studies teachers from around the state around using game-based learning. We got them copies of a game, history game to teach in their classroom. We trained them how to use all this sort of thing, sent them out, and the system breaks down so much of what you're wanting to do. We had some teachers where their tech coordinators just would flatly refuse to work with them. They accused them of stealing the game because they didn't want to install it, and we had to go in and send receipts to show the game had been purchased and all this sort of thing, and that, yes, you can install it. We had other teachers who their server system changed, and so they could no longer even install the game on the computer after 1 year. And we had teachers who left the profession simply because of their being so disgruntled with the lack of support for them being creative as professionals and doing what they think best for the child. So there's so many barriers in place in the current system, and how things are so teacher-centric and dumped on the teacher and time-driven, that it's not an environment that's easily conducive to doing these sorts of things, which are focused more on engagement and love of learning and tied into critical thinking and these sorts of components. So I'll start with that kind of answer, and then I'll come back to the divide that exists between commercial and educational games. And I certainly think that is an issue. Again, commercial video games, they are game designers. They're focused on the play aspect, and that's great. We need that. But we also need to know, we need people who understand how people learn and how we can leverage both aspects of those. And then on the other side of things, as a person who's an expert in education and instructional design, I don't have time to keep up with Unity and how to do Unity. And when I was first starting, I had some of those skills, and I thought, yes, I'd like to do that. I'd like to keep up with that. But just realistically, you have so much time in the day. You cannot be an effective game designer or game developer. So my focus is largely around the game design and the educational design, and then hiring people who have the skills to do what I need them to do. So it's always that sort of bridge. Are there people out there who carry the skills and the talent and the knowledge of both those worlds? Maybe, but it's probably rare. And then it's bringing them together. And on the commercial game side of things, we're talking about multi-million-dollar projects for a lot of the mainstream games. Whereas on the educational side of thing, we're trying to get grant funding to make what we can and to do what we can. I do teach a course on educational game design. The focus is on design, not development, but they have to create a prototype, whether it's paper or digital, to be able to test their gameplay components. And it's getting easier every year for these platforms to come out where people can actually develop their games. RPG Maker, even kind of choose your own adventure sort of narrative driven games like Inkle Writer, and some of these others. There's more and more platforms where you don't have to be a hotshot programmer to make it happen. But if you're not doing that, there's of course going to be a certain threshold of level of the sort of game that you can be designing and developing. I do think it's a mistake to think that we can only have effective game-based learning that's going to come out of something that looks like Horizon Zero Dawn or The Last of Us 2 or something like that, where these games have millions and millions of dollars and hundreds of people working on them. That's not realistic for most educational video games, but that doesn't mean that it can't be successful. We are not trying to create a game better than Horizon Zero Dawn. We're trying to create a game that's better than the textbook and the teacher lecturing, right? Our competition is not the top commercial video games out there in terms of entertainment. Well, that would be great if we could get them to play our educational video game instead of these leading commercial games. That's not realistic, and that's not what we're looking for.
in your view, this is maybe the penultimate question of our research, and so it is a bit broad, but in your view, can video games play a role in addressing society's collective memory of certain events?
So I certainly think they can play a role. With collective memory, we're talking about large groups of people. So obviously we have different generations. It's unlikely that an educational video game is going to be impacting my parents' collective memory of something, but certainly my nephews and nieces. We know that kids these days are interacting with games more than any other form of media, whether it be movies or books. That's their go-to. That's what they're used to engaging with. So it only makes sense that if we're wanting to impact their understanding and their knowledge about something like this in particular, that games be playing a role in doing that, because that's what they're going to. That's what they're looking to. That's what they're talking with their friends about. That's what they're engaging and playing with their friends is around games. So if we ignore games as a form to be communicating those issues to them, in a lot of ways, I think they're just going to be left behind. So certainly can play a large role. And we know gamers nowadays, I'm certainly, not young anymore, and I grew up a gamer, so my generation is there. The gamer generation and people playing video games has gotten older and older, since games have been around. So certainly there's a large contingent of the population that is used to engaging with video games.
Yeah, I think that's particularly something we've been focusing on, just because we have, many different people in part of our project right now, and that there's a level of surprise of when we bring up the statistics of how many people, what kind of different population parts of the population play video games, and that it is really, it's really grown up with people. So yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to mention, because it was the beginning of your answer that I had the thought, and then I was taken away to the second part. Is, well, because you say that there's these barriers. I think I'm trying to with this, I'm trying to find melding to see how can we get these commercial games, how educational can these commercial games be, maybe not in a classroom setting, because obviously there are all these barriers to bring them to the classroom setting, that it's basically based on the attitude of the school system. And this is something I discussed with the lead designer of Pass Out, that it's so local, getting these games in, because every kind of municipality, or not municipality, but region has maybe a different approach to education, and some are maybe more open and less open, or willing to try these different things, and so it's easier to kind of approach from these lower but these how, yeah. Actually, I don't have a good question, but I've been thinking about it, because I guess I'm writing a report at the end of this, so I'm trying to figure out. But I really like your approach on that. Video games are a way to hook people in and inspire them to research further. I think that is a very valuable input, that even though, I think the future of education is not that every classroom is going to, every class is going to have a video game, and that this is going to be the way forward. It's just maybe it's not plausible technologically, or we're not seeing this change in the current systems. But
well, I mean, yeah, I really do think it's more about attitude and the system not being designed to support that sort of thing. It's the same. It doesn't just have to be video games. If you look at problem-based learning, it's difficult to get in the classroom. They're putting more and more on teachers, so they have less time to actually devote to professional development and learning how to do these sorts of new things. So that's always going to be a challenge. But I would say I've actually seen a definite uptick in that as new generations of teachers have come in. They are gamers. They're used to gamers. It's something that they want to do. So my son he's in 4th grade, and he has had games involved in some sense, not a core part of the curriculum, but here and there in the curriculum, I think for 3 of his 4 grades now in some sense. So it doesn't mean they're being used in the exact way that I would like, or at the depth that I would think would be optimal, but people are getting used to them, and parents get it. You go to the department store, you see educational games for sale on the shelf, so it's not a foreign concept to people. I think people get it, and I think at some point our educational system is going to have to change. We're operating at about the most effective level we can for what it's no longer doing what it was. Our needs are no longer what it was designed to do, and at some point societies are going to recognize that and realize that we have to move beyond this sort of sorting system that we have now where some are going to learn and some are not, and that's okay, and we're okay with that. So at some point the system is going to change and become more supportive of that. But I do think there's room for it to occur, whether it's more people are getting, particularly with the pandemic, more people are getting familiar with flipped classroom approaches or blended approaches. So it could be playing the games at home if they have their own devices, or at the local libraries or school libraries or these sorts of things. And then if they want to spend the class time more teacher directed activities like they're used to, that can be built around the game experience where they're doing it, or using the game briefly in class as a hook to get them into further, like I said, basing further material that would be more traditional around the game, but a short period of game time to get that hook, and then the students may be interested in moving forward. I can tell you that if the students are given the opportunity to play a game, to learn, they're going to jump at that opportunity. They're going to be excited about that opportunity. They love the games. They play the games with their friends. So the opportunity to learn around that's a homework that they're much more likely to be engaged around completing than it is to read a chapter in the book or something like that. So whether we're talking after school programs where the games are coming in there, or whether we're talking with, like I said, the game-based learning where the gameplay can be happening at home or elsewhere, I think the cracks are starting to show, and we're seeing it more and more coming in. And I think, if you look at Microsoft with Minecraft EDU, they're a good example of how both in formal learning environments and non-formal learning environments, they're leveraging this to have learning take place. They're doing hackathons around particular issues where the kids are used to playing Minecraft anyway. They get introduced to Minecraft EDU, and they can be creating their own environments around these learning opportunities, and in some cases creating environments that will help others learn about the topic as well. So today's generations of kids are going to be growing up building their own games as well. They're getting used to that sort of concept. The platforms are only going to get easier and easier to develop in, and so we're going to see the kids are going to be expecting it. They're going to be demanding it, and eventually I think we'll see that continue to grow. The example I usually give in my games class around the accessibility that's coming around now is when Angry Birds first hit the App Store, it was the dominant game that was out there for I think like 2.5 months or something like that. But the game that finally actually knocked it out of first place was a math education game designed by a middle schooler for his younger brother. So he designed, using a platform he didn't know how to program, he used a platform, learned their scripting language, and he created a math game for his younger brother. And for one brief period, it bumped Angry Birds out of first place, So this is a non-programmer, a middle schooler who did that for his little brother and found success with it. That's only going to become more and more common as these kids are used to making their own content. And certainly we can leverage that to create content that can educate others. There's a web-based game called Aidi that's about poverty in Haiti, and how education can be a pathway out of that, but also just the difficulty of life in Haiti and the poverty and the challenges that come with that. And that was developed by a group of high schoolers in, I want to say, inner city New York, around a game-based learning curriculum where it was them learning by creating their own games, and then they create a game that then goes forward and educates others even more so. So I think we'll continue to see that grow, and we'll continue to see adoption. It's definitely slower than we would like, but there's still a place for it.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, as I guess I think as the students evolve in the future, and as the teachers evolve in the future, it's just going to be teaching methods and interests are just going to evolve with them. And so yeah, I think it's a great point to see how this kind of video games or this kind of different kind of way of learning will be incorporated in the future. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's kind of rounding off everything that I wanted to touch on. Thank you so much for your time.